Hi, and welcome back to College Questions. My name is Nick. I am the founder of Dawes Academics Consulting LLC, and I'm an independent educational consultant who helps students and their families apply to college and try to make the whole process a little bit less stressful. This week, I wanted to talk about the digital SAT. It's coming. You've probably heard about it, and you're wondering, is this something I should be worried about? Do I need to take the paper SAT now in order to avoid the digital SAT later? Or is the digital SAT going to be okay? And I'm here to tell you that the College Board has been fending off concerns about bias in testing for decades now. The SAT used to be a 1,600-point test back in the 90s and early 2000s. In around 2005, they revamped the test after accusations of bias and specifically socioeconomic bias. And so they separated the reading section and the writing section, made the whole test 2,400 points instead of 1,600 points. They got rid of analogies and some of these other generic test questions and really tried to focus in on reading skills, vocabulary, grammar, math, and then the essay. In about 2016, they revamped the SAT again. They recombined the reading and writing section into one section that's out of 800 points in order to more accurately weight the math section and the reading writing. And they did have an essay when this revamped version of the test came out, but now it does not have an essay portion at all. And now, next March, we think the SAT is going digital. Specifically, the biggest difference is going to be that it's what we call an adaptive test. And whenever the format changes, whether it was in 2005, 2016, or 2024, there's always profound anxiety among students and families about what's going to happen. How is it going to be different? Is it going to be easier? Is it going to be harder? Uh, and how is your student, or you, if you are a student yourself, how is your performance on the test going to be affected by these format changes? So let's talk a little bit about the digital SAT, how it's going to work, what we know about when it's coming out, and whether or not you should rush to take the SAT now or wait until after some of the first digital administrations happen next year. So, should you really be concerned about the digital SAT? Not really. The new format will probably cause a temporary dip in scores. That happened in 2016 when the test changed as well. Uh, it took about a year, maybe two, for scores to normalize. But at the same time, I'm not going to encourage you to rush out and take the first digital test in March either. For those of you interested in numbers, when the 2016 format first came out, about 84,000 ish students scored in the highest score band, according to College Board, which I think was above a 1450 or above a 1500. By the very next year, that number had almost doubled to like 148,000 ish. And then the next year it went up to about 156 ish thousand, if I recall correctly. But there was a corresponding increase in the total number of students taking the SAT. So it kind of increased proportionally. So after about 1 year, people had kind of figured out the format, figured out how the test was asking questions, and performance had improved as you would expect. So when new formats come out, there are always logistical hurdles. And this is going to be doubly true for the digital test. And this is why I don't recommend you go take it in March or May or June. You really want to leave those first 3, maybe 4 test administrations. Let proctors figure out how the test is going to work. Let them figure out Blue Book. Let them figure out what they need to do. If there's an issue, if the Wi-Fi goes down, if someone needs a charger, let them figure all that stuff out in those first 3 or 4 testing administrations. Blue Book has been around now since 2021 or 2020. Thank you, COVID. And College Board has been using this Blue Book app to do AP testing, but they've never had to use it at this scale. So there's surely going to be logistical hurdles and problems. The test rolled out digitally for international students this March, just a few months ago. And results have been pretty decent, but that does not mean that there won't be logistical problems when it hits the United States next March. The other reality is that when the new testing format comes out, the test might not be perfectly calibrated. When the 2016 test first came out, the current version of the paper SAT, it looked a little bit different from the paper SAT we have today. Certain questions were worded differently, and certain question types have been completely dropped that existed in the first few iterations of the current iteration of the SAT. And so as College Board got more testing data, they were able to tighten down the phrasing on some of these questions, remove the question types that didn't seem to be serving their purpose, and we ended up with the SAT that we have currently. So again, even after these logistical hurdles are overcome, there might be some small changes to the digital SAT as they get more and more testing administrations under their belt and they get data about how students perform on these tests. It's very possible that there are going to be certain question types that are on the digital test that disappear entirely after the first year or so. So it's always good to let them work through those kinks, get through the growing pains, and then start actually taking the official versions of the test at that point. So the earliest I would recommend that you take the digital test would probably be around October 2024, maybe August at the absolute earliest, but September, October are going to be better testing administrations, I think, after they've gotten at least 3 or 4 testings out of the way and they have a bunch of data from students. So what does the digital test look like? Well, it's still going to be 2 fundamental sections, a reading writing section and a math section. It's still going to be scored 200 points to 800 points per section for a maximum total of 1,600 points. College Board's goal is for the scores on the digital test to be comparable to the scores on the paper test. So if a student takes the paper test now, their score can be compared to a student who will take the digital test this time next year, or I guess June of next year, because there is no test in July. So what's different then? Well, other than it being digital, and I'll talk more about the digital tools in a minute, each of these sections is going to be broken into 2 chunks. There's going to be a module 1 and a module 2 for reading, writing, and for math. The first module for each is their sort of benchmark module. They will ask you the same kinds of questions that other students are being asked. You will get questions perhaps with slightly different numbers in them from other students on the math section, or on the reading section, the questions might be in a slightly different order, or the answer choices might be jumbled up so that answer A on your test is answer D on someone else's test in order to prevent, looking at someone else's screen. But by and large, the test is going to be the same for everybody on that first section, that first module. Module 2 is where it will start to significantly differ. The College Board is going to be able to shorten this test significantly over the paper test. And part of why is that they are using some learning theory and question theory in order to produce algorithms that can target your student's ability or your ability based on how you perform in the first section. So your score on the first section will determine which of 2 possible paths you will take on the second section. There will be an easier module 2, and there will be a more difficult module 2, depending on how you perform in module 1. The easier module 2 will still use the same 5 levels of difficulty questions as the paper test uses now and as Module 1 will use, but the mix of the questions might be a little bit different. There might be fewer level 5 questions, the most difficult kind. And they will end up capping your maximum possible score if you get Module 1. Your maximum possible score could be somewhere between 650 and 700, really depending on how your student performs and how other students perform, because there is always a slight curve to every SAT administration. If you get the harder Module 2, then your maximum possible score will be 800, and the mix of questions will probably be fairly similar to the benchmark module, if not maybe a little bit more difficult. The same will be true for the math section as well. So the question types might heavily diverge for students when they reach Module 2. The other big difference between this and the paper SAT is that the reading and writing are no longer two distinct sections of the test with their scores combined. They are truly one section of the test now. They're going to ask you reading questions first and then writing questions second, but they are in the same section of the test with one timer that runs for both types of questions, instead of having a reading section and then a pause and then a writing section that is completely separate. The other big difference for reading and writing is that instead of having long passages of 500 to 700 words and then asking you 10 to 11 questions, the digital SAT is going to give you one 70 to 120 word passage and then ask you one question. On the downside, this means that there is more reading per question on the digital SAT. It's less reading overall because instead of answering about 99 questions like you do on the paper SAT, you're answering about 54 questions on the digital SAT, so almost half the questions. So it's less reading overall than the paper test, but there's more potential reading per question because instead of an average of like 57-ish words per question, it's an average of about 80-something words per question. But on the other hand, if you get a passage that's really difficult to understand, it's only going to impact one question. Where if you get a difficult passage on the current paper SAT, it's going to impact 10, maybe 11 of the questions that you answer in that section, 20%, which is fairly significant. So there's a little bit of a give and a take with how the reading functions in the digital version of the test over the paper version of the test. For the math section, they are doing away with the no calculator section that they have on the current paper test. You will have access to something called Desmos, which is a graphing calculator that is built into the app Bluebook. And it's a fairly robust, powerful graphing calculator. And you will have that for the entirety of the test. They're also going to build in some quality of life features, things that students might be able to do on a paper test, like cross out wrong answer choices or flag a question to come back to it in later on if you have additional time. You'll be able to highlight information in reading passages or in word problems in the math section. The math module will also still have word problems, but the word problems they say are going to be a little bit more concise, a little bit more straightforward. They're not going to try to give you tricky wording. I don't know if they will still provide like data that's not relevant to answering the question, but they've said that they're going to make the word problems more concise and more direct than the current version of the test. So that's going to help as well. So overall, the test is going to be significantly shorter, about 33% or about an hour. So instead of a 3-hour test, we're talking about a 2-hour test, which is another significant benefit over the current test because testing fatigue is real. And so sitting for less time means that you're going to perform at your peak ability for more of the test or a greater percentage of the duration of the test. So there are some pros. there are some cons. The other biggest con, most obvious one, is that you're taking it on a screen. Some people don't read on a screen as well as they read on paper. Processing screens and writing on a screen is different from processing paper writing. Studies have shown this so far in behavioral psychology and other fields. So that might pose a challenge for some students. But again, those are the major differences on the test. The test is still going to use Algebra 2 as its highest level of math. And so that should still be a serious benchmark for whether you're prepared to take the test or not. So, should you rush to take the paper SAT right now? Well, probably not. For most of you, probably not. There are some generally agreed on principles for when you should take the SAT or when you should take the ACT. And I will be discussing the timeline of when you should start preparing, when you should actually take it in the next video. But in general, you should still base your decision on when you complete Algebra 2. If you are a sophomore this coming school year for 2023-2024, if you're going to be a sophomore and you have not completed Algebra 2, do not worry about the digital SAT. Yes, it will come out. And yes, you will take the digital SAT, but it will be fine. By the time your junior year begins, the digital SAT will have had at least 3, if not 4, test administrations. So they will have worked out most of the kinks, and it should be okay. If you are a junior this coming year for 2023-2024, if you are a junior and you have not finished Algebra 2, then you're in a little bit of a tight spot. You should probably start preparing and try to take the paper SAT now, even though you have not completed Algebra 2. Do some additional studying for the remainder of the summer, do some studying in the fall, and try to take the October, November, December SATs. Or at least the November, December SATs. I always recommend students do it twice. You'll always see a small score jump on your second test, even though you won't have completed Algebra 2. The reason is that if you don't take it now, this fall, the digital test will come out in March, and then you will have to take the March, the May, the June, and possibly the August. You'll take 3 of those 4 or 2 of those 4 SATs. And those are going to be the ones where they're still working out the kinks. Those are going to be the ones where they're still having logistical issues. And so I really don't recommend that you take those tests if you can help it. So taking the last few paper SATs in November and December would probably be advantageous. There's plenty of testing resources out there in the world that exist for the paper test. There are plenty of practice tests that you can use to prepare. So that's what I would recommend that you do if you're going to be a junior. If you're a sophomore, I wouldn't even worry about it. I would focus on your schooling, focus on your extracurriculars, and then summer, after the digital test is started, you can begin preparing to take the digital test. And you'll take the digital test in the fall of your junior year or winter junior year, maybe in the spring of junior year as you finish Algebra 2. And the digital test will have worked its kinks out by then. So that would be my recommendation. So again, if you're a rising sophomore, don't worry about it. You can prepare once the digital tests has come out. You'll have the summertime between sophomore and junior year to prepare. You'll have the fall of junior year to prepare. You will be okay. It's the rising juniors who are going to be in a bit of a hard spot. Even if you haven't completed Algebra 2 yet, I would start preparing and learning. Preview those math concepts. Take practice SATs. Download the paper practice tests that are on College Board's website. If you have the resources, or you can find a community group that will give you some study tips and help you prepare for the SAT, I recommend that you find somebody to help you prepare for the SAT if you haven't already taken Algebra 2. If you have taken Algebra 2, you can self-study, or you can find somebody to help you, like a tutor or a community group that will offer free testing prep. That can work as well. But for those of you who are sophomores and those of you who are freshmen, I would not stress out about the digital test. Just take the digital test after it comes out. After they've worked out the kinks, it will probably be a better test overall than the current SAT is. If you rush to try to take the paper test to avoid the digital test and you're not ready, this is just going to be a recipe for stressing you out, stressing your parents out, or if your parents, stressing your student out, because midway through, they're not going to be happy with their scores. And then you're going to have to take the digital test after it comes out. So you're going to switch from the paper format to the digital format midway. And then you're going to have to learn the whole thing over again. So that's a recipe for stress and for anxiety. Better to not rush headfirst into it and then have to pivot afterwards. Just relax, freshmen and sophomores. Wait for the digital test. It'll all be fine. So I hope you find this video helpful. Again, if you have any questions or things that you want me to cover in a future video, you can email me at collegequestions@dawesacademics.com. That's DAWES academics.com. And if you want to read the blog post upon which this video is based, you can find the link to that in the description below. I will also include the link to my testing resources page and my website should you have any questions or if you're looking for some personalized support as you make your way through high school. And with that, I will see you next week.